To another good week?
To another good week.
Okay.
Okay,
We're going to talk about something that's pissing me off.
Okay, folks.
And we're going to give you a hypothetical. Hang on. Max, we're going to give you a hypothetical. Okay?
Yeah.
So let's say...
Any resemblance to reality, etc., etc.
Yeah, it's not intended.
Right.
So let's say we have Mr. X. Mr. X is, let's say, 38 years of age. Miss B is 16 at the time they meet. Both of them are drug addicts and are unfortunately at a low point in their life. Miss B is not living at home. She's in some center, but she has some sort of part-time job and does other things, and happens to be in, maybe through her will or not, the sex trade industry. They meet up by happenstance and start doing drugs together and become friends.
Right.
And they're friends for about a year, during which time they feed off of each other's addiction, and Miss B then says, starts phoning him and using him to buy drugs for her. It's not costing her anything. She's saying, this is great. I'm thinking I'm controlling the guy. I'm manipulating him. I'm getting free drugs. It's amazing. But the reality is they develop a friendship. They're both addicts, and they talk. And he is a professional, but never really made it. I'm just going to say a professional. So he's not working as a professional. Basically, he's stealing from his parents to feed his drug addiction, and works a part-time job. Has no assets, drives a crummy car, and lives at home. And they have some intimate contact, and then on one occasion have intercourse. And the Miss B says that, at the time, I really liked him. I cared about him. I didn't want him to think this was a one-way thing, so I did sex with him because I wanted him to continue to buy me drugs, but I also liked him. I wasn't opposed to sex. And on the night that we had sex, I really did want to be with him. But then 2 years later, after I've talked to some therapist, I look back, it was a very unhealthy relationship. And wow, that power dynamic. He's a professional. He was 39. I was vulnerable. I was 16. And so I think I was manipulated. And Mr. X is charged with sexual assault, sexual exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, what's sexual exploitation?
I've been waiting for this. So this is going to sound dry, but it's not. It's a bit...
We do dry, and people like it.
We have to do dry sometimes. It's just a lot of legalese, so I'll try to say it slowly, listen carefully, and I'll repeat if I have to. So this is the Criminal Code section for sexual exploitation. It's section 153 sub 1. Every person commits an offense who is in a position of trust or authority towards a young person, who is a person with whom the young person is in a relationship of dependency, or who is in a relationship with a young person that is exploitative of that young person.
Glad we got you there, and you haven't even been drinking.
I know. Can you believe that? Slurring already. This water's, cut me off.
It's strong water, man.
Strong water. Cut me off. And who, for sexual purpose, touches directly or indirectly with a part of the body or with an object, any part of the body of the young person, or for sexual purpose invites, counsels, or incites a young person to touch directly, indirectly, with a part of the body or with an object, the body of any person, including the body of the person who so invites, counsels, or incites, and the body of the young person. God, that's all a mouthful. Do you want to summarize that or repeat it?
No, so
that's the offense, and then there's a very important inference that we got to talk about. So I think everyone gets a picture of the offense. It's this whole idea of someone who's in a position of trust or authority towards a young person. But what does that mean? So they define it in section 153 1.2, and they say, a judge may infer that a person is in a relationship with a young person that is exploitative of that young person from the nature and circumstances of the relationship. So nice general, broad.
And go slowly.
No definition. And now slowly. Including the age of the young person, the age difference between the person and the young person, the evolution of the relationship, and the degree of control or influence by the person over the young person. And this is
and we're talking about somebody who's younger than 18,
right,
but 16 or older.
Right. This is the part where you can start losing it.
Okay, so this is important. So those are the factors, and essentially the section is directed at, or the purpose of the section is that a young person's ability to consent to sex is essentially vitiated because of the dynamic which is in place that they are being exploited. And that, in essence, they would be in a position of vulnerability. Now, as Michael indicated, it's an approach the court will take to try and determine, is there a meaning or relationship of trust and authority? And you typically will think about a coach, a trainee, a parent-child, an uncle, a tutor-student, a spiritual guiding individual, a mentor of some kind. Those are the typical relationships where you will see a position of authority.
Babysitters,
teachers, therapists, teachers, doctors, all those types of things. But it can be a little bit more amorphous, like, some sort of mentor of some kind. And they build, and they're based on some sort of a trusting, authoritarian relationship. And the test that the courts generally employ is that they have to find that the person stood in a position of trust towards the complainant when the sexual acts took place. Not 2 years later, you think they did, but at the time that the sexual acts took place. And to establish this, the courts will consider the factors that Michael indicated. No one factor is determinative, but each can play a role. So,
basically very gray.
Think about this for a moment. We don't live in the 1950s, and I don't know what it was like then because I wasn't born, but I know I look like I do. No. But, we live in a much more how do I say it? Nuanced society.
Nuanced.
There's all sorts of relationships. There are, the taboos attached to dating somebody who's 20 years younger than you is different now. There's all different,
different
concepts,
shades of gray.
Different shades of gray.
Different shades of gray.
There's lots of different relationships.
Right.
Okay.
And genders, apparently.
Yes. And so, to try and apply a purist type of approach to this is not applicable, even though some crown attorneys or judges may want to. That's just not applicable. That's just not legitimate. So as you're watching this podcast, maybe make a comment or send an email. What's your answer? The fact scenario that we gave you, is that a position of trust or authority such that you would say on its face that there is some degree of exploitation because of the age difference, how the relationship evolved. They met by happenstance and started to do drugs together. He wasn't there to buy sex from her. They weren't there to do anything untoward. There was no mentoring or anything of the nature. They just happened to become friends. He was a professional, so from time to time they'd talk about his work, or would talk about his work, and that sometimes would overflow as to things that she was thinking about or that was happening in her life. But do you think that the age, the way it evolved, is there evidence also of control or influence? I say it's impossible to find that.
Right. And also... okay, there's a
before you get into that, this is such a slippery slope that we haven't discussed this before in our 2.5 years of doing this podcast. And it should be so rarely used, this type of provision. But it's not that rare.
No.
And it's really, really insidious. Because when you take traditional or purist type of approach, you'd say, well, the age itself, right. She's under 18, but she's of age consent. And he is, some years older, 22 years older or 23 years older. And they're buying drugs together. It's so easy to be seduced into saying that he should have known better as somebody who is 20 or 21 or 22 years older, But that doesn't make him a f***ing criminal. That doesn't make, in our hypothetical, a person a sex offender.
Right.
And that can easily happen. This is you got to be very careful about this analysis.
Well, I was just going to add. No, there was one interesting case. Her Majesty the Queen and Daniel Bovay, Bovay, from the Superior Court of Justice, and I like at least the court recognizes this. They said it is insufficient for the purposes of that section for the Crown to prove there is a relationship of trust, power, and authority. There must also be evidence that the accused induced the sexual activity through an abuse of a position over the complainant. So as you're saying...
Say that slow.
I'll say it again.
Because that's really good.
It is. It is insufficient for the purposes of, let's call it this section, for the Crown to prove there's a relationship of trust, power, and authority. There must also be evidence that the accused induced the sexual activity through an abuse of that position over the complainant. That's a lot of components that are easy to skip over.
Yeah.
As you were just saying, right?
There's cases that say that when people are drug buddies, for example, that relationship lacks the necessary elements to make it a relationship of trust. Although age difference can increase the likelihood of a trust relationship, age by itself is not determinative.
Right.
There are cases where even involving doctor-patient, when the facts are analyzed, the fact that an accused alluded once to his incomplete medical training is irrelevant. He did not offer her medical advice, health-related discussions, and were not part of the relationship. And there's another case where, in fact, you can have somebody who's actually a healthcare provider, but if they're not in the relationship of providing medical advice, health-related discussions, etc., it's not a position of authority, because it's frightening to think that just by having your own occupation, you could be in a position of authority. So then having certain relationships is completely off the table for you.
Right.
And to grow, let's talk about control and influence, because we talked some time ago about celebrities, and we talked about people who are in positions where they have lots of wealth and businesses, and that they leverage that wealth or that celebrity status in order to have somebody be with them and then have sex with them. Of course, the flip side of that is someone might be very attracted to that individual because of their celebrity status or their success in business or what have you. And in and of itself, I'm having a very hard time with the fact that that should be something that would cause such an imbalance that any sexual contact could be deemed to be a sexual assault.
Right.
That's very, very frightening, because we can think of a plethora of relationships where if you wanted to be strictly analytical, you could find possibly control and influence. You could possibly find a position of authority where you ought not, because this is not how we interact as human beings.
Right. But does that position induce what follows? That's the question.
And then you get into the same arguments we get to in a sexual assault case, where somebody might say, I was sort of being groomed because of this position, and I those are very stark examples where you have, I think, traditionally somebody who's a patient of a therapist, induced through that process. Somebody who's a tutor and a student and builds a relationship and grooms them, and then eventually through that relationship induces to sexual contact.
Yeah.
Not when you have these types of relationships where there's an age difference, where people are just meeting together because they're interested in drugs, where actually the complainant in this hypothetical case thought that they were using the other one.
Right.
These facts don't fit. This particular fact scenario, which is not, far-fetched, can lead to a wrongful conviction. And what I think we have to talk about is, although there are those individuals certainly who can be quite vulnerable to people who are in positions of trust, this can be very easily misused to create a wrongful conviction.
Oh,
this provision.
Completely. The babysitter examples, the coaches examples, all of those. They were popping up all over the place in our research.
Yeah, and we've seen, actually, there was one case where I think we spoke about it before, where a coach was charged and unfortunately never made it to retain because committed suicide. because couldn't believe what was happening. It was an absolute fabrication, according to the person, and then we don't know what the truth is because they committed suicide. That's just how serious these allegations are to people.
So talk from a Crown's perspective, why would you bother with this charge then? Is it simply the position angle? Like why if you can get away with a sex assault charge, right? Why bother with exploitation? Just because of the optics?
Well, because in a case like this, so at the nub of this hypothetical,
hypothetical, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more,
is the fact that the complainant is saying at the time, essentially, I consented.
Right.
So in this hypothetical, if there was cross-examination, the evidence would yield that the person would say, I had a choice.
Right.
I knew what the acts were, and I willingly participated.
Right.
But after having spoken to a therapist or a counselor talking to me about that relationship, who told me it was an unhealthy relationship, that's when I determined that I was really being manipulated and exploited.
Right, just so our viewers understand why a Crown would charge, right? There's the sex assault, right? But then there's...
It's not a sex assault.
Right, because she consented.
They're saying it's vitiated because of the exploitive relationship.
Well, that's the little circle that we're explaining.
The difficulty I have, and this is where... This is why we wanted to bring up this hypothetical in this case law, because it can be very, very easy to try and suggest that what somebody said and did at the time vis-a-vis consent or agreement, however you want to refer to it, really isn't accurate. It's their hindsight bias, which is truthful. Okay? Right? Because this is hindsight bias. This is somebody 2 years later saying, because I've had counseling or what have you, I have changed my perspective. Well, that's hindsight bias.
That's what Professor Loftus was talking about.
Yeah, that's why we're doing this now, because it was so interesting. And Professor Loftus, which was so great, was talking about how often in therapy, memories can become distorted.
Relabeled, distorted.
And influenced something that may in fact be an innocent relationship and or innocent interaction can then become criminal. And this type of hypothetical is a perfect example. And the problem that we want to identify about this during this podcast, building on what Professor Loftus said, is that I don't think a prosecution should ever go ahead when somebody clearly says, at the time I was agreeing, I wasn't opposed, there were reasons I was involved in doing this, but because of therapy, I look back, and it was,
now I feel
a power imbalance.
Now I feel there was
no prosecution should go ahead on that basis. Am I wrong?
No, you're not. You're absolutely right. It's insane.
And imagine how you can apply this then, if a case like that is to succeed. That could be then a precedent for other relationships, where somebody could say, well, I was dating somebody who was 17 years older than me. They were a politician.
My piano teacher, whatever.
No, but let's say, somebody, a politician, and I was, a student at the time. Right. And, afterward I look back, because of his role and everything he was talking to me about, I look back and I can see really that he was exerting control and influence over me, and that I was really not consenting. Right. Just think about how f***ing lame that, and how thin that foundation is.
Yeah.
And how this can lead to being used in the future for wrongful convictions.
Of course. I'm not happy with my life now. Let's find reasons for that. Oh, there's one.
If I were to say that on Twitter, I can tell you that there would be a number of individuals who will come out who are lawyers in this province.
No names.
And would say, no, I can add another one to the list. It was actually a personal injury lawyer at a f***ing firm who said to me, oh, no, in my experience, in my 20 years of suing, perpetrators on behalf of victims, I find that it's incredibly small that there's any false allegations.
Oh, that guy.
Like, there's f***ing me.
You should respond with, what is a woman?
Yeah, really. I responded with, like, what the f*** do you read? And you're an ambulance chaser, so f*** off. Because we're not talking about, like, serious litigation here.
No.
And I would be jumped on by any number of people to say, No, what I'm saying is a lie. It's a myth. And yet this hypothetical, could very well lead to a conviction. And it's not the first type of variation of that hypothetical that I have actually seen. So when you misapply provisions like this to fact scenarios that we would think, in some very traditional conservative view, it can play all sorts of mischief and create havoc.
Right. Well, especially in this hypothetical. I can't wink very well. You have to do it for me. But
that's okay.
Thanks.
I can wink for you. But then I want, I think what's interesting here is the concept of control and influence is so being manipulated that buying drugs. How about buying dinner? How about shopping? I'll give you one more hypothetical example, okay? Mr. Y likes to meet people, women, on the internet on these dating sites, some which are more known to be hookup sites than others.
I think they're apps now. The sites are kind of...
Sorry,
it's okay. I'm the IT
showing
guy.
my age.
I'm the IT guy.
And Mr. Y says, why don't you come over? Let's do some online shopping. Oh, I don't believe you. How about I send you an e-transfer? Okay, send me an e-transfer, says Miss A. Sends over an e-transfer, $1,500. Oh, wow. I guess you're real. Okay, sure. Where do you live? I'll pay for your Uber. Uber over, and they have dinner, and they have wine, and they go online shopping, and $3,000 worth of shopping is bought. And then throughout the night, they wind up having sexual relations. And in the morning, he gives her a check, and she leaves and deposits the check, which bounces. And the person in this hypothetical is found out by her parents. She's not that young. She's about 20 in my hypothetical.
I remember this hypothetical.
Yeah, in my hypothetical. And then says, I was raped. That was not my intention. I was raped. Meanwhile, in her account is $1,500, and in her delivery through whatever it is about $3,000 in clothing items.
Not bad.
And his essentially induced her into these sexual acts by this exploitive.
Right. Yeah.
In that hypothetical, I'm pretty sure it will eventually hypothetically be withdrawn.
Hypothetically.
Through some very good work and use of a private investigator to have another witness, because there was another party there who might have been partaking in this event who saw it completely different and didn't want to lie.
You must spend all day thinking these hypotheticals up.
I spend a lot of time because I really enjoy this podcast and I want our viewers to really get the message that we send out. So I spend a lot of time on these hypotheticals. This happens, right?
Hypothetically.
And that's why I'm trying to say, it's not like we don't live in this conservative society. People enjoy relationships and interacting in all sorts of different ways. To other people, you might think it's up. Right. Others, they might think this is kind of cool and fun. Who cares? I'm not judging anybody.
Right.
Like,
No, of course.
life is life. Like,
yeah.
As long as nobody really gets hurt, God bless you. Enjoy yourself. Right. If there's really a sexual assault, like we said millions of times, absolutely report it. But if you're caught and your parents are pissed off at you and the check bounced and that pisses you off, that doesn't make it a sex assault.
No, it doesn't.
Nor does, frankly, if somebody has power because they're successful in business and they've made money and they can do this for somebody else, that doesn't also make control and influence in and of itself.
Does not equal exploitation.
And it just so happens in this hypothetical, there's a 10-year age difference. Mm-hmm. So this is not so infrequent.
No, not these days.
And it can get abused by lack of using discretion as to what really should be prosecuted or not. And I just thought we'd bring it up for this episode because we talk about sexual assault cases. We've talked about coercive control. We had that really great episode with Professor Loftus. But I haven't brought this up. I don't know why this escaped me, the sexual exploitation, because I did have these hypotheticals floating around in my mind, or maybe in my office. But and I just thought it's important.
And hypothetical files.
Yeah.
That's the way we store these hypotheticals.
But it really, it's just an interesting thing because this is just two examples of how this can be wrongful convictions.
Was the hypothetical, the second hypothetical, he was charged with exploitation?
No, but it's not sexual exploitation, but the actual argument
Right.
is exactly the
Yeah,
same.
it's this. I was going to say.
That although maybe she consented, it can't really consent because of the control and influence he was exerting.
Right.
They were having wine. He was buying stuff for her. He was seducing her as a result of this relationship. It infantilizes the complainant by saying, well, if I choose to act this way, why can I not agree to it?
That's right.
And it just reminds me of this provision. Anyways, I think this is something that we have to revisit if these hypotheticals are ultimately dealt with.
They will be.
And we could revisit what the outcome of this is. What's your parting comments?
Good luck with the hypotheticals.
Okay, that's a good one. All right.
And I think I'm involved in one of the hypotheticals.
You may be involved in one of those
Yeah,
hypotheticals.
so
So I think what
good
we're
luck
going to
to me
do,
too,
we're
yeah.
going to come back. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to have another memory expert
Yes.
coming on the show. We got to book the date
Yes.
because, some people had some interesting comments about our memory episode. I think it's really important because it's not just the issues about recovered memory. It's not just the issues about what may be a fractured memory. It's also about influence.
Shaping of memories.
Yeah.
That's huge now.
And so we're going to have this other, it's a professor with a
Professor
PhD
from Portsmouth, UK.
so he's done interesting studies, done interesting work. We're delighted to have him come on. We'll pick the date, but we're gonna have this as a theme throughout some of our upcoming podcasts because I think we really have to get back into understanding, the science of memory, how it works, and how it influences a criminal prosecution, how you defend against it, and just how we look at influence on memory and on a person's belief as to what happened.
Very important.
Okay, so why don't you get the pillow?
Get the pillow. Oh, it's all the way over here. I got the pillow. Joe?
Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And keep sending in your questions, please. They're very, very good. Somebody actually wrote us today with another 2 people we're going to take a look at who would be interesting guests. So we love it. Thank you for all your viewing and your support. Have a good night and a good week.
Ditto.
Bye.
Bye.